He is one of the 20th century's greatest aviators. He has played a major part in the evolution of flight, and in the process set records that will never be broken.
Well, I was brought up in the borders of Scotland. I was born in Edinburgh, but lived for a long time in the borders. And my parents were both from the borders of Scotland. So my background is entirely lowland Scottish. My father was in the Royal Flying Corps during World War I. Now, originally he was a balloon observer, and that was a fairly hazardous occupation. And after a while he decided that it might be a little less dangerous if he became a pilot. So he switched to flying, but late in the war, and he was still under training when the war ended. However, he moved over to the RAF and stayed with them for a considerable time, almost up to the beginning of World War II. He came out for a while, but went back again. So I had a flying background, and he always encouraged me in this flying business, and he operated from an airfield fairly close to home at Turnhouse in Edinburgh, where there was an auxiliary Air Force squadron. And they, at that particular time, were flying Gloucester Gamecocks. This was in the early days, and they eventually moved over to Gauntlets. But when I was, I think, about 8 years old, he took me up in a Gamecock and sat me on his knee. And of course, at that age, I hadn't the leg length to reach the rudder pedals, so he let me handle the stick a little. We didn't do anything aerobatic or anything like that. It was just fairly straight and level, give me a feel for the stick, etc. And generally encouraging me to take an interest in aviation, much to my mother's horror, I may say, who got involved in the tug-of-war in this business of my interest in aviation. But she died when I was 13. So my father had a free field to work on. And, of course, I loved every minute of it, frankly. And inevitably, after I went to Edinburgh University at the age of 17, I joined the University Air Squadron. My father was in an organisation which was often set up after World War I of former combatants meeting to exchange their experiences and just generally socialise. And the leader of the group in Germany was the well-known aerobatic pilot Ernst Udet. So we went there, and my father asked if he could bring me. So by this time I was 17, and that was quite acceptable to them. And so we went with the joint purpose of watching the Olympics and enjoying the socialising with the former Luftwaffe. And Udet was a total extrovert, delightful guy to be with, because he didn't speak very good English at this stage. And I spoke just what I would call schoolboy German at that stage. And however, we clicked very well, and he was extremely friendly. I had rather feared as a young boy I might be brushed aside with all these elderly aviators, but on the contrary, they were very welcoming. And indeed, Udet asked me if I'd like to go for a flight with him. And this was unexpected, but he took the time off to drive me down to an airfield called Halle, south of Berlin, and where he had a Booker Jungmann, which was a lovely little two-seat trainer stationed there. And when we arrived, after a drive, which was not exactly chatty, but we reached with our imperfect languages, managing to make ourselves known. And when we got there, he strapped me into the rear seat of this aircraft, and he was particularly careful in doing this. I thought, in fact, he was a bit over-anxious that I was properly strapped in, but I was to find out why later. Anyway, off we went and had a very delightful flight. I wouldn't call it a very simple, straightforward flight because, of course, he was an aerobatic expert. And I realized why I was strapped in so well. And he did a lot of maneuvers that really tested my stomach, rather to their limits. But after about half an hour, we headed back to the airfield. And on the approach, I would say at about probably 100 feet, he turned the aircraft upside down. Now, I thought at this stage he can't really have meant to do this, and I was very concerned that something had happened to him, like a heart attack or something of this type. And we approached the whole way down till I would say about 50 feet, inverted towards the runway, and I thought really this was my demise looming on the horizon. But at about 50 feet, he turned it over, which with its wingspan didn't give it too much clearance on the ground, and as we settled upright, so to speak, he just flopped onto the runway and burst into roars of laughter because he knew he'd frightened the life out of me. And we taxied in, and he helped me out, and he was very charming. He slapped me heartily on the back and gave me the old fighter pilot's greeting, Halsund Beinbruch, which is what the Germans used to say in World War I to a comrade who, after he'd won a combat. So that was my introduction to, if you like, the German side of aviation, which later on was to develop, because Udet, after on the way home, he said to me, you know, you must work on your German and you must try and get into a flying organization. And because I hadn't yet joined the University Air Squadron. So when I got home, I was already doing a languages degree, so I would be working on that anyway. But by joining the University Air Squadron, I fulfilled his other condition. And he said, if you achieve something in both these, come back and see me. I thought this was just, a polite social remark. But in fact, he meant it, because in 1938, I revisited Germany purely for pleasure. And I looked up Udet in Berlin. He'd given me his address. And to my astonishment, he greeted me like a long-lost chum. And I didn't stay with him. I stayed in a little local guest house. But I went most days to see him in the evenings when he came back from work, at his invitation. And his house, frankly, was like the waiting room at Manchester Central Station, because the people were coming and going all the time, and most of them personalities in the then emerging Luftwaffe. So it was quite interesting. For example, there were people like Werner Mulders, Hannah Reich, designers, for example, Winkle occasionally appeared. So, and one of the most impressive chaps was the young chief of the air staff called Yashonik. And he was a very good-looking chap and spoke very well and was very interesting. So there was no restriction on the conversation. Either they thought I wouldn't understand it all, although by this time I was beginning to be pretty good in German, and I conversed with them in German, not in English. I really began to feel that I was getting a grip and a feel of what was emerging in the new Luftwaffe. And here we were in Nazi Germany. How was the feeling? It was one of excitement, really, because everything was happening at that time in Germany. And there were parades galore. And although this is all very militaristic, to a young boy like myself at that time, it was exciting stuff going on all around you. And I was in a country where there didn't seem to be any unemployment. Everybody seemed to get about their business quite well. And for the young in the country, there was almost endless aviation facilities provided at weekends. And I used to go up to these flying clubs at weekends, and they would welcome you and let you go into the clubhouse, read their magazines. They never offered you a flight, but as I say, the atmosphere was quite welcoming, although I was a foreigner. As long as I could talk aviation, they accepted it. So that was Germany in 1938. Of course, I had to be trained, and we were training then on what was a fairly new trainer, the Miles Magister. And after that, I gradually graduated onto Gloucester gauntlets. These were being supplied at this point to auxiliary Air Force squadrons. And the University Air Squadron was connected at Edinburgh with the 603 Auxiliary Air Force Squadron. So it was a lovely airplane, the little gauntlet, an aerobatic gem, really, and you couldn't ask for much more. And eventually, when I was later to fly its father, so to speak, the Gloucester Gladiator, which was a really probably the best of all the biplane fighters there were at that time in the late 1930s. So it was a great experience with offering opportunities too. When I was at university, it was a 4-year course, my honours degree in modern languages, and during the early stages, the Foreign Office used to visit the university, the languages department, looking for possible bright boys to recruit. And I was asked if I would be interested in joining the diplomatic corps. And I said I was, and they said, well, what it will involve is in your penultimate year, That'll be the third year of your course. You will have to go abroad, and since German is your primary language, you'll have to spend at least 6 months in Germany. You will be sent to a school on our recommendation, and you will teach English to the pupils and brush up your German while you're there. So in the summer of 1939, I went to the boarding school called Salem on the Lake Constance. Now that used to be the center with the great educationalist Kurt Hahn there. But he had to leave in about 1938 because the Nazis were bringing pressure on him. He was a Jew, and obviously he saw the light and moved out. But when I was there, it was run by Prince George of Hanover, and it was really a delightful establishment. And, of course, Kurt Hahn, as you know, formed Gordonston in Scotland. So you can compare Salem, in a way, with Gordonston as it is, or as it was in its early days. I'd gone up on the 3rd of September 1939 to spend the weekend in Munich. A delightful town and very interesting, and I was staying in a small, fairly cheap hotel. And I have to tell you, and I was a lucky boy, in those days I owned an MG Magnet, and I'd taken that with me, and it was parked in the courtyard, and at 6 o'clock in the morning of 3rd September, there was a thunderous knock on my door, and in came a lady with 2 SS officers and said, "Our countries are at war, and I'm afraid you'll have to come with us." So they gave me time to dress, and off I was taken. And I asked about my car, and they said, "Oh, I'm afraid you can't take anything with you." So I had to leave my clothes. I had some books with me, some for studying at the weekend, things like that. I had to leave the lot, which they collected, I may say later, as I found out, and was taken to an SS jail where I spent 3 days. Of course, when the lady said our countries are at war at 6 o'clock on the 3rd, technically she was incorrect because they weren't at war till 11 o'clock, but that's a moot point. And I wasn't treated badly at all. In fact, quite well. They were interested in talking because I could talk reasonable German by this time. And my concern was, here we are at the very beginning of a war. How long is it going to last? Am I going to be here for the duration? Now, the Foreign Office were pretty naughty because what I didn't know was I wasn't the only one doing this in Germany. There were 20 British students scattered throughout Germany doing what I was doing. And this was the important point. There were 20 Germans doing the same in Britain. If I'd known that, I'd have been a happy boy, because we were exchanged eventually after 3 days through the Red Cross in Switzerland. And what was interesting was, on the 3rd day, this young SS lieutenant said to me, "You're being taken to the Swiss frontier for an exchange through the Red Cross," which I was delighted. And I was ushered out into a large Mercedes, and as we bowled along, I could look at it only had a little window at the back, and there coming behind me was my MG Magnet, with an SS sergeant with his entire head above the windscreen. Huge fellow driving it. Anyway, we went to the Swiss frontier, which was about an hour and a half's drive or so. And Then I got out, and the young lieutenant who was with me said, they're expecting you. There was a bridge over a ravine at this point in the border, and he said, on the other side of the bridge is Switzerland, and you're expected, and you can have your car. And I said, you've taken my clothes, my money, my books. Why are you giving me my car? And his reply, if I translate it from the German, was typically Teutonic. He said, because we have no spares. So that was that. So I went over this bridge with my car, and although he had said the Swiss were expecting me, it didn't seem like it, because I got a very, very stony reception from the Swiss border guards. And in fact, they made me get out of my car and put me into a small, was almost like a telephone booth. And I had to wait there about an hour while they contacted the embassy in Bern and got clearance for me to go up there. But anyway, I got to Bern, and the ambassador interrogated me there and told me that in the light of the fact that I was in the University Air Squadron, I better get back as quickly as possible. So he gave me petrol coupons to get back. And I got to Calais, and the RAC man at Calais said, you can't take your car because there's only military vehicles allowed. So I left it there thinking that was the last I'd see of it. But I must say, to my utter surprise, the RAC got it back a month later. So I joined them and have been with them ever since. Of course, I had to report to the RAF, and this was the period of what's called the Phony War. Well, there wasn't much activity going on operationally, and I, being young and keen, found this inactivity very boring, frankly. And about the middle of September, the Royal Navy had an aircraft carrier, the Courageous, sunk in the southern Irish Sea. And they lost most of the pilots in that sinking. And a notice went up on the RAF notice board saying that the Fleet Air Arm was short of pilots, and if anybody would like to move over, would they put their names down, and the Royal Navy would be advised. So I did this, thinking, well, they've had action, they've been sunk, I might get onto an aircraft carrier right away and have some action. Of course, it didn't turn out like this. I was accepted by the Fleet Air Arm, but they wanted me to do their course of training. The Navy did it differently from the RAF, but after it was over a year before I actually got a posting to a squadron that was going to go on an aircraft carrier. But by this time, at first, when I joined the Fleet Air Arm, they didn't have much in the way of exciting aircraft, certainly not on the fighter side. By the time I got my posting to my first squadron, the Americans had offered us, from their stock of aircraft, naval aircraft, a thing called the Grumman Wildcat on lease land. Now, this was an exciting airplane for us because it was, if you compare it, probably up to the performance capacity of the Hurricane, which was the RAF's top fighter at that time. So it was very exciting to be drafted into a squadron that had this aircraft, because it was a first-class aircraft, rugged, good firepower, specially built for deck landing, for the naval environment. So it was absolutely perfect for our choice. I was in the squadron flying a Wildcat, and they had a safety harness which only had a lap strap across your abdomen. And, of course, for deck landing, you're jerked very heavily forward by being arrested during the landing, so it was decreed that we have shoulder straps as well. The object of this flight was to take the Wildcat down to Croydon for modification to have these. Now, I had arrived just as far south as Lincoln when I ran into atrocious weather and crept my way, thankfully, into RAF Cranwell. And when I got out of my aircraft, I knew it was the mother station of the RAF. I expected there to be RAF people everywhere. To my utter surprise, there were just hordes of civilians around. Few RAF uniforms, but mainly civilians, in large numbers. So I wondered what was going on. But they all played like Guy Hawkes conspirators. Nobody would tell me really what was happening on the station. And there was obviously something afoot. Anyway, next day, I was roomed, incidentally, with a flight lieutenant in the RAF, who it turned out in later life was to be the very involved in what was happening. And I'll explain in a minute. But next day, when I got up, I walked down to the airfield, to air traffic control, and the weather was still pretty bad, probably a cloud base of about 300 to 500 feet. And they asked me if I'd do an weather test rather, just to get up and see what the cloud base was. So I did this for them. And I noticed a lot of activity from the air. I could see this activity at one hangar. And but the hangar doors were closed and I couldn't see anything inside. So I did, in the course of the day, I did three weather tests for them. And finally, around about 7 o'clock in the evening, it was beginning to lift. And there was furious activity at this hangar. And they eventually rolled out an aircraft, the like of which I'd never seen before, because it had no propeller on it at all. It was a quite tiny little aircraft, and it had an engine, when they started it up, made a rather piercing whistle. And, of course, this was Britain's first jet aircraft, the Gloucester E-28-39. And the pilot taxied out the runway. It was a tricycle, too. That was another unique factor for us. And I watched this thing take off. It did a fairly short flight. I would say probably, it struck me of being the order of 20 minutes, probably, before it landed very smoothly. I realized then that when it landed, a huge horde of people dashed over and surrounded it, and prominent amongst them was a wing commander in RAF uniform who, as I found out later, was called Whittle. And of course, this was Frank Whittle himself. So that was my first ever connection with the E-28-39. And although I didn't actually speak to Frank Whittle, I didn't get near him, at least I'd seen the great man. And of course, both these things, the airplane and Whittle, were to play quite a part in my later life. We were, as a squadron, posted to the very first and the tiniest operational escort carrier. It really was a brainchild of Churchill, because this vessel had been captured in the West Indies by a British cruiser, and it was originally a banana boat practicing in the Caribbean, and was brought back to this country, and Churchill put up the idea that if they just sliced the top off this vessel, put a flat flight deck on, we'd have a small carrier, which would be ideal for escorting convoys. Now, it was very basic. Whereas a normal aircraft carrier these days had a flight deck with a length of about 800 feet. This little vessel, total length was 420 feet. It didn't have a hangar. All the aircraft, when I say all, there were only 6 Wildcats, were parked on the deck permanently. So that was a slice off the length of 420 feet, the park at the back. And it had only 2 arrestor wires. These were main arrestor wires, and then an emergency arrestor wire, which we called the for Christ's sake wire, because if you caught this, you had missed the main 2, and this brought you up with a very, very sharp arresting, but at the same time, as the arrest, or the for Christ's sake wire pulled out, it collapsed the crash barrier ahead of you. So it was, that was the arrangement. Everything was extremely tight. And of course, we were operating in the Bay of Biscay eventually, so this thing moved about a lot. However, before we got to being operational, we had to do our first deck landing, as you say. And half of the pilots in the squadron had been on the bigger carriers before. And when they saw this small thing, it must have frightened the life out of them. But to me, I had never seen an aircraft carrier before, so it was just another adventure and a challenge. And frankly, I enjoyed it. And we did this landing in the western approaches. The island of Ailsa Craig is just off the Ayrshire coast. And it was, I could see Ailsa Craig, so you can gauge where the area was, just south of the Mullican Tower. And it, frankly, from the air, it looked like a matchbox floating in the sea. But I didn't find any great trouble with it, frankly. And I did my 4 landings, I think it was, and that qualified me, and we were off shortly into operations. We knew we were going to have a rough time because, as I said, the Bay of Biscay is noted for its bad weather and heavy seas. We also knew we were up against a formidable enemy because our real targets were the Focke-Wulf 200, which had been known as a civil airliner called the Condor, but had been modified into a very, very potent sort of 4-engined reconnaissance stroke bomber aircraft. Heavily armed, very heavily armed, and had a very long endurance and a long range. And it was a great threat to the convoys because what it was doing was finding the convoys, giving their position to the U-boat wolf packs which were around, and they closed on the convoys and attacked, mainly at night, of course. So we didn't have long to wait because on our very first voyage, we came across the first of these couriers. This was the military Condor, was called the Courier, and two of our aircraft went up to attack. The courier, unfortunately, had already done some damage. It had bombed the convoy and caused a few casualties. These were transported onto a hospital ship we had with us, and in spite of it flying the Red Cross, the Condor bombed it, and I'm afraid caused a lot of casualties of the people who were already wounded from the previous bombings. Anyway, it set the hospital ship on fire, and at that stage it was caught up by the first two Wildcats. And the pair were our commanding officer and his wingman. And the CO set the inner engine of the Condor on fire, or the Courier on fire, and obviously would probably have given it the coup de grace, but he went in to have a closer look at what damage he had done, and they opened fire on him, and they heavily armed. They were a 20mm cannon, and when he realized he was being fired on, he turned away rapidly, but a cannon shell went clean through the underbody of the aircraft and killed him. So we lost our CO within minutes of the first combat. Yes, it is electrifying, and you feel a little helpless because you know that your bullets, even though the Wildcat had .5 bullets, you know very well they're not going to penetrate the hull of a submarine. But at least you can fire at the conning tower and force them to dive. And that was all we could do. But interestingly enough, the one major attack that was made on a submarine, the first major attack, I should say, was made in a submarine, was by our CO's wingman. And he dived down on it because there were people on the conning tower, and he fired on it with these .5s, but they had manned their 20mm on the casing of the thing and actually shot him down. And we found out later, when his body was recovered, that the shell had gone through and hit the stick and took the top of the control stick and his right hand off. So, of course, he had no control at all and went straight in and was killed. So we respected this. We realized that you could not afford to take it easy and think that it was a one-sided battle with these people. And I later on found two U-boats on the surface with a plank between them, well out from the convoy, of course, and obviously one of them was in serious trouble of some sort. And because they were moving across this plank and helping one another. And when I caught them, they were still engaged in this, and I killed quite a few of them walking or in this area of trying to rush into the conning tower across the plank to get out of danger. But they immediately dived and left the plank and whatnot, and we believe one of them had been badly damaged because it was eventually lost without ever being attacked. Dönitz in his diary just reported that it vanished. So obviously it had been badly damaged and probably was lost diving without proper repair. But it goes to show that there were plenty of U-boats around this convoy, and up to that point, in fact, it was the most heavily attacked convoy of World War II, up to that point. Of course, it's a thrill because it's a dark, menacing shape. It really looks evil. And you think to yourself, well, it may not be a pleasant life down there, but they seem to be at an advantage situation at the moment, because we were a slow convoy. We were a convoy doing probably a maximum of about 10 knots. And when they have a target like this, and there are so many of them, obviously all coordinating the attack, the odds are fairly heavily stacked on their side. We were very fortunate in having probably the best convoy protection commander of the war in Commander Walker, who became very famous as the for his anti-submarine attacks. He was very much on the ball, always alert, ready to go for them and take on any challenge, even ramming a submarine at the expense of his own boat, damaging heavily, but he would go for them. And they were difficult to get, because I've seen a situation where the submarine was actually turning inside the circle that a corvette could turn in, so they were highly maneuverable. And Walker was, as I say, always ready to attack, and he knew we were being heavily targeted all the time. So it was a tense situation. We had some very difficult weather, and while it was difficult for the pilots, the back end of the vessel, the worst we had was it was moving through an arc of 60 feet. Now, that was virtually impossible for landing, but we were up there and had to get back. You could take off, provided the timing was you waited till the vessel was on the upswing, then charged up, you were going uphill, and then it would gradually come down, and so you'd reach the bows by the time it was about level, and that was fine for takeoff. But deck landing was a very difficult business to judge, and we had a case of one of our pilots actually being hit by the stern as it came up and literally tossed into the air. The aircraft went straight over the side and into the sea, which was boiling at that time. But the corvettes rushed in and picked up the pilots, so all was well. But these were the hazards we had: high seas and a pitching deck. Now, bad enough for the pilots, but think of the poor ground crew. We had no hangar. These 6 aircraft were parked at the stern, tied down by cables at night, and were being serviced. The only time that they were available for servicing was in the dark at night. These troops were going around with a back end moving up and down, water pouring over them, slippery conditions, with a small torch with a piece of blue paper over the front to look into the engine, etc. I think they were pushed to the limit, but they did all this without any moans or groans. Were quite remarkable. So this resulted in a tremendous rapport, inevitably, between the ground crew and the pilots. We knew as pilots that our life depended on these guys giving us a machine that wouldn't let us down in a very hostile environment. As I say, it was a matter of personal judgment doing a landing in these heavily pitching decks. You obviously would try to land on just as it got virtually to level, and then it would go down So you were running uphill, that would be fine. But to judge to that degree was extremely difficult. I was hit in the air by a 20mm cannon shell, which came from an aircraft. I would call it a random shot because the aircraft was a 4-engine. It was higher than us, probably a Condor, but it was just, we had just sighted it, were heading up towards it, it was going into cloud, when this shell smashed through my windscreen. Now, we had armor-plated windscreens, but a 20mm cannon shell really damaged it very badly. And we didn't wear, since we were at low altitude, we didn't wear oxygen masks. So my face was exposed, and a large piece of the glass from the screen came into my mouth. I maybe opened my mouth in amazement, or what should you say, not amazement, but a reaction to being hit. And I think this concussed me, because I've no recollection of what happened after that for quite a while. But apparently my wing leader, I was the number 2, came alongside me, realized I'd been hit, and was afraid that I would become unconscious, and that would have been that. So he kept talking to me all the time, trying to keep me going. He said I wasn't responding, but when he means responding, I wasn't talking to him. But he said I appeared to be doing what he told me to do with the aircraft. In other words, fly straight now, or turn right now, or turn left. And he talked me down onto fortunately, it wasn't a day where the aircraft carrier was pitching, talked me down onto the deck. And I've no recollection of landing on at all. But I caught the for Christ's sake wire, and I didn't do my face any good on the gun sight, because although we had shoulder straps on, I had foolishly just used my lap strap. And so I caused my own grief there. So what the windscreen had done to me, plus what the gun sight did to me, was they needed a little bit of repair work. So I was out for the rest of that particular trip. But that was the very first convoy. So I was okay for the second one. Having had a hard lesson, the whole squadron, from the loss of our squadron commander, I then studied this aircraft very carefully to see where its armament was and how it could bring it to bear against an attacking aircraft. And I realized that there was no blind spot except from the front. They had a cannon in a turret on the top of a dorsal turret on the top, and I realized that it was limited to the amount it could come down before it was in danger of hitting its own fuselage. So I knew how much it could be depressed. And then from the bottom cannon they had in a gondola underneath. The same reason I realized there was a limitation on how much it could be elevated. So with these two limited for depression and elevation, there was a blind spot dead ahead. Now, it wasn't blind in the sense there was no armament there, but the armament was 2 fixed machine guns, and the pilot was the only one that could bring them to bear, and he could only bring them to bear by moving the total aircraft, which was very limiting for him. So this was, if you like, not totally blind, but it certainly was the most vulnerable form of attack. So when I eventually managed to get this aircraft into a situation where he was nipping in and out of cloud, it was rather difficult to keep up with him. eventually I made an absolutely flat attack, not a diving attack, had to be absolutely flat. And I did that, and when I opened fire, I could see the pilot's windscreen shattering. And obviously, if that shattered, I must have killed both of the first and the second pilot, because as soon as I did that, it began to fall down. And went in a very flat attitude. It was, I think, beginning of a spin, actually, in a very flat attitude into the sea, to such a degree that two of the crew managed to crawl out of it, probably very badly hurt, but they were still appeared to be still alive. But of course, they were left there. There was nobody to save them, so they probably drowned there, I would think. So that was my first attack. And I had a similar one the second time, but in the second case, they were all lost. I think there was 7 crew in the aircraft. But having worked out this head-on attack, as we called it, the other guys quizzed me on this, of course, and they all adopted the same thing. So as a result, after the CO's aircraft, the one in which he was killed, the one he brought down, we brought down 4 more using the head-on attack. This was the second convoy, which was between Liverpool and Gibraltar, returning from Gibraltar. And we were put under immense attack 1 night after leaving Gibraltar. And we had, interestingly enough, we had some survivors from the sinking of the Ark Royal on board. So they were into their second lot on this. And we were attacked, and we realized under heavy attack, and our captain made the decision. He had 2 options. One was that the carrier was normally, there were 5 lines of vessels, about 4 or 5 in a line. Walker would put the carrier right in the middle line, so it was furthest away from attack. But our captain, who was senior to Walker, made his own decision. He decided that was putting the merchant ships at too much risk with a large number of submarines attacking or U-boats attacking. So he came out into the open and decided he'd go at full speed, which was only 14 knots, but zigzag throughout the night, clear of the convoy. Well, we'd been doing that for maybe an hour or so when a U-boat source fired a random torpedo at us in the hope of having a strike, because we were zigzagging at 14 knots. And as his luck would have it, hit our rudder, carried the rudder away. We could still do 14 knots, but we had no steering. And darkness, the captain decided we would hit the convoy if we went on like this. So he hove to, hoping he had escaped the U-boat. But just as we settled and the U-boat surfaced about 200 yards on our port side, and we could see the captain of the U-boat quite clearly on the conning tower with the braid of his hat. And our captain called all the crew of the Audacity onto the flight deck, because he realized that with the possibility of abandoning ship. And he alerted us to this. And while we were there was this uncanny period, which may have been as much as 10 minutes, where we were looking at each other when one of the sailors' nerves broke and he rushed into one of our 20-millimeter cannon and opened fire at the U-boat, which was a hopeless thing to do. But, as I say, probably his nerve had broken. And, of course, in retort, the captain of the U-boat fired 4 torpedoes, all of which struck us, and the entire bows of the carrier fell off. And, of course, when they went, she tipped up immediately. And as she did, the cables holding down the Wildcats at the back all snapped. I'll never forget the twang as they snapped. And they came rushing down the deck into 400 sailors and just wiped out dozens of them, knocking them over the side, killing them on impact, and so on and so forth. Utter chaos. And most of them just ran to the edge and jumped off. And, of course, jumping off the deck, rearing up as it was, they were jumping off from a height of maybe 50, 60, even 70 feet. So it was pandemonium. When I heard the twang of the cables going, I realized what was going to happen. So I went immediately to the side and jumped off. I had already, before I'd assembled in the flight deck, I'd gone down and got my flight jacket, because this was the 21st of December, and in the Bay of Biscay, it wasn't going to be warm in there. So when I was at least in a flight jacket and a Mae West. All the pilots were wearing Mae West, and all the sailors were wearing a very basic arrangement. It was really like an inner tube around their middle with 2 tapes over the shoulders. That was all they had. Anyway, jumping off into the sea was a bit of a hazard, because quite apart from the height, and you may break legs or anything, there was a danger of jumping onto people, because by this time there were dozens in the water. And but having survived that, I swam to a Carly float, but they were all already full of people. And when I got to this Carly float, they have little looped ropes around the side. I held on to one of these, and we were all speaking to each other. We were quite just thankful to be in this situation, really. And the corvettes had arrived to pick people up. And I found myself with my flight leader, and he said to me, let's swim towards the corvette, which we did. And suddenly the corvettes all took off, vanished. Now, the reason was they had picked up quite a large number of survivors, so they were pretty full, and they got a NASDAQ ping that the submarine was still in the area. And the last thing they wanted to be was torpedoed and sunk with all these survivors aboard. So they vanished with the intention of coming back as soon as possible. But we were left for 3 or 4 hours in the water, and what we did was he and I tied ourselves together and then got a group of sailors. We were 26 in all, and we all tied ourselves together with the bits of cord and string we had from these things. And we kept together for about certainly an hour and a bit. And then the first of the sailors they had fallen asleep, and obviously hypothermia was setting in. And as they fell asleep, they toppled forward, of course, with these just having a rubber tube around you. And heads going into the water and just drowned. And, of course, they were dead weight. And I'm afraid we had to be ruthless and just cut each one that drowned off. And after 3 hours, I'm afraid the only one surviving was the flight commander and myself. The reason being we had Mae Wests, which supported our necks, our heads, kept them above water. And it is a horrible thing to realize that your companions are just not surviving. Maybe another thing was they weren't as fit as we were. As pilots, we had to keep ourselves pretty damn fit. We had medicals every 6 months. And I think these chaps were just not as fit as we were and didn't have the right sort of life jackets. And after about 3 hours or 4 hours, the corvettes came back and they hoisted us out of the water. Amongst the lot I was with, well, reasonably, were the captain and the navigator. And he was being hauled up into the corvette, not the one I was on, because we were hauled up by lines. Our legs had gone, and being in water for cold water for about 4 hours. They had to pull us up on lines. And he was being hauled up when the line snapped. And he went forward, and I think he struck the hull of the corvette and knocked him unconscious because he just went in the water and vanished. So it was very bad luck. So we lost about a third of the ship's company, roughly. The squadron, obviously, we had about 2 weeks' leave, survivor's leave, and then we were all recalled to reform the squadron with Hurricanes at Yeovilton in Somerset. And having reformed and retrained, we were told we were going to another escort carrier, but one which had been built by the Americans in the Kaiser's shipyards. It was called HMS Avenger. Now, they came out in alphabetical order, so it was probably the first American carrier to come over, these escort carriers. And they went off to the Mediterranean. We were to go to the Mediterranean. But just prior to embarking, I was told that I was required to be kept behind for a series of trials of Hurricanes and Spitfires on escort carriers. Now, why was I tossed into the test world? I didn't discover till later on that the captain of the Audacity had written in my confidential report on the first trip to, well, maybe after 1.5 trips, but he had left the details at Gibraltar and they had gone to Admiralty eventually. These were the confidential reports on the pilots. And he had said in mine that I had a facility for deck landing and they should try and make use of this. So that's why I did realize at the time, that's why I was hauled out to go on this test job to see if a Hurricane could be landed on an escort carrier and then a Seafire. Seafire and Hurricane had already been landed on big carriers, but these were half-size carriers. So both trials were successful. So from then on, I was allotted to this test unit called the Service Trials Unit for the Navy. And I stayed with them for over a year, and then was moved to the Test Evaluation Squadron at Boscombe Down. And I had just settled in there, had been about a month at Boscombe Down, when the naval test pilot at Farnborough was killed deck landing a Seafire on wasn't a small carrier, it was a medium carrier. We had the small, the medium, and the large, and he was killed on that. So I got what is called in the Navy a pierhead jump from Boscombe Down to Farnborough. Obviously, things like the landings in Italy were coming up in the course of the war, and the Canadians were to be involved in this. And we were going to have escort carriers, of course, in this battle. And it was felt that the RAF may find themselves in a position where they were attacking land targets and were not able to come back to airfields because our army hadn't yet been able to overrun these airfields. So their only home to come back to was the aircraft carriers. Therefore, they should have some idea of how to get onto these aircraft carriers. So I was sent to Kenley, to the Seafire wing, to the Spitfire wing there, to teach the Canadians or give them some idea how to land on a carrier, the technique involved. They were not very receptive. They were heavily involved in their own kind of wars with Spitfires, and which was mainly ground attack work, but also in combat with 109s and 190s. And Canadians being what they are, the only way I could get them to agree to do some deck landing training was they said, we'll do one for every sortie you do with us. So this was the deal. And so I did a few what they called rhubarbs and things like this over in France. But it was an insight into the sort of life they were leading, and which was quite hectic and quite dangerous. And there were shoals of 109s and 190s around, so one had to keep one's wits about one to survive. So I had a very short spell with them, probably just under a month, I think. Fighter sweeps were new to me, of course, and to see large numbers of aircraft like this, I don't see how people could be frightened, because there were so many aircraft and all doing the same thing, and you felt this is tremendous to have all this support with you, and you're not a loner in there at great risk. You're all going in together, and I got into the spirit of the thing, and terrible thing to say, but I enjoyed it, frankly. And you're not supposed to enjoy wars, but there you are. It's the spirit gets to you. These were a pretty happy-go-lucky bunch, the Canadians. They really were. It was enjoy today because there may not be a tomorrow. That was their attitude to life. When I got to Boscombe Down, I had been almost entirely a single-engined piston-engine pilot. And suddenly I was thrown into a place where twins and four-engine aircraft abounded. So I had to have my experience extended a bit. And the powers that be there determined I should do this as quickly as possible. So I was popped onto twins and then onto four engines, which was very fortunate because I'd only been at Boscombe Down, just a month, when I got a phone call from the Admiralty, but they rang me up and asked me if I thought it was possible to land a Mosquito on a carrier, twin-engined aircraft. Well, I had minimum twin-engined experience, and but with all the brash sort of, if you like, confidence of youth, I said, oh, yes, I can do that. And so they said, right, you're on your way to Farnborough as a replacement pilot. And they told me the pilot there had been killed. So I arrived at Farnborough on the 17th of January, and I had never even seen a mosquito till I got to Boscombe Down. And I hadn't flown one till I arrived at Farnborough. So I had to learn to fly the aircraft and work up on it to land it on a carrier. Now, I didn't realize what I was up against, but here I had experienced boffins at Farnborough, and they called it Mission Impossible, because you land an aircraft on a carrier. Your approach speed is about 1.1 times or 1.15 at the maximum times the stalling speed. The stalling speed of the Mosquito, with everything down, was 110 miles an hour. And the boffins at Farnborough, who were in the Naval Aircraft Department, said that the maximum speed that the arrestor wires would accept a mosquito on a carrier was 86 miles an hour. The stalling speed is 110, so I should have been landing on at 115 or so, and they wanted me to land on 86, which is below the stalling speed. So we had to work that one out. Now, the only way of doing that is to, normally you land on with a little engine power as you come onto the carrier, but with this, I'd have to use almost half engine power and hang on the propellers and until I was about maybe 3 feet off the deck, then cut the engines when the aircraft would just fall out of the sky. So it was quite a hazardous thing. We were going to start with the aircraft as light as they could get it, which was 16,000 pounds, but eventually we were going to work up till it was with max bomb load at 22,000 pounds. And yet the trials went very successfully, and all was well. Now, the reason for this was the Navy did not intend to operate mosquitoes off carriers. It was for a special operation, a sort of naval dam busters raid. In the dam busters raid, Barnes Wallis had invented the spitting bomb. Now, as it was used in the dam busters raid, that spitting bomb looked like an oil drum. But to get it into a mosquito, that shape was unacceptable. It didn't work it wasn't compatible with the bomb bay. So we had a totally spherical bouncing bomb. And the idea was these mosquitoes were going to be taken out on 2 carriers to Japan, and a raid was to be made against warships, mainly battleships, in harbour on the Japanese mainland. And the pilots wouldn't have the range to get there without being taken out in carriers. They would fly off the carriers, and then they would be asked to land back on. They had never done a mosquito landing. They had only landed in training with Barracudas, which is the easiest of the deck landing aircraft we had. So they had only a vague, really, conception of what they were called to do. But this way we thought at least we'll save most of them. The mosquito pilots trained for this operation, which was called Operation Highball. And the 2 carriers had taken them out to Australia. They had done their training, and they were ready. The projected date for the attack was to be in a fortnight's time. But before it happened, the atom bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and then later on Nagasaki, and that was it. All the atomic attacks happened before the highball attack, so it was cancelled. In many ways, I think for the pilots, fortunate, because I don't know how many would have had rather serious trouble trying to get back on the carriers. Of course, the Navy were alerted to the fact that twin-engined aircraft could be operated on a carrier, and they offered so much more potential, better weight carriers and load carriers, and they could offer a very high performance. So they began to take an interest in it. But there was one problem. If you lost an engine on a twin-engine aircraft, it was virtually impossible to get it back on an aircraft carrier, because at the speeds at which we've talked about, 1.1 times the stalling speed, you cannot control an airplane at that lower speed with one engine out. The torque of the live engine overcomes it. We tried many ways of overcoming this single engine thing, but there was no real answer to it at that stage. However, one of the experiments was to have handed props. In other words, unlike the Mosquito, which had two props going in the same direction, it was difficult you had heavy torque on takeoff and heavy torque when you were with one engine. We devised to have handed props, in other words, each engine having them going in the opposite direction, which eliminated takeoff swing, but still didn't eliminate the landing problem. In fact, that was never eliminated until the format for the Gannet was invented. Nevertheless, the Hornet, which was really a single-engined, single-seat Mosquito, much smaller aircraft, much greater engine power, and delightfully light to fly. Well, I did the landings, and it's a strange coincidence. The landings were made on the day the atom bomb was dropped and the war came to an end, the one at Nagasaki. But, so it never came into the war, but we were provided with a delightful airplane, and I class the Hornet, the Havilland Hornet, as the finest piston-engined aircraft I have ever flown. And that was brought into the Navy in 1946. When the war in Europe had been basically at what we call low to medium level, that is to say heights not much above 20,000 feet. That went for both fighters and bombers. But this all changed in 1943 with the arrival of the 8th United States Army Air Force with the Flying Fortresses, because they operated at 30,000 or 30 plus feet. So suddenly the whole war was transformed into a high-level war. Now, once you do that, you run into problems associated with flying in thin air near the speed of sound. Because at low level, the air is thicker, the speed of sound is higher, so you're unlikely to reach it. You will not reach it at low levels. But once you get into thin air, the speed of sound becomes less, and you can get into trouble at in the transonic speed region by a thing called compressibility. In effect, what it amounts to is any aircraft sends a pressure wave ahead of it, which opens the air for it to pass through. Now, if it's not going terribly fast, there is time for the air to open and it to pass through. Once you get up to high altitude, where the speed of sound is less, these pressure waves do not have the time to open up the passage of air for you, and the one pressure wave tends to build up after another, and they compress against each other and form the phenomenon of compressibility, which in effect is building up a barrier of air ahead of you. And if you strike this barrier of air, it is literally like running into a brick wall. And you get huge amount of vibration, and you get, the worst thing is, a vast amount change of trim. The aircraft suddenly goes nose down, and there is nothing, you mustn't touch the trimmer. If you start that, you'll probably break the trim off the trim tab off the elevator. All you can do is haul, and you may have a haul of as much as 100 pounds, which the pilot, if he can't haul it, he's doomed. He's going to go straight into the ground. Anyway, the HUSAF had their bombers up there. At first, they thought they could operate without fighter protection. They thought they had enough firepower. They soon got disillusioned about that and realized they weren't going to cope unless they had fighter escort. Now, at that time, they only had as fighter escort either the P-38 Lightning or the P-47 Thunderbolt, both American aircraft, of course. And General Doolittle came to command this bomber force near the end of 1943. And he realized that the losses were still heavy. And when he interrogated the crews on the Flying Fortress, particularly the tail gunner and the ball turret gunner, told him that they saw the German aircraft climbing up to attack, and their fighter escort, which would be high cover, they were diving down to intercept the German aircraft, but not in doing anything, not intercepting, just going straight past them and making a hole in the ground eventually. And what was going on? And of course, the answer was they were getting into compressibility trouble, losing this trim change, couldn't hold the trim change, and vanishing, just nose down all the way down. So General Doolittle came to us and said, could we look into what was happening? We found that the German aircraft could fight up to a Mach number. Now, Mach 1 is the speed of sound, up to a Mach number of 0.75, 3/4 of the speed of sound. They could actually maneuver at that speed. These Lightning and the Thunderbolt couldn't maneuver much above 0.7. In other words, they were fighting an enemy that could go at 0.75, and they could only cope with about 0.68 or 0.7. So they were out of the game as far as combat was concerned at high altitude. But by the grace of God, at this point, there appeared on the horizon the Mustang, which was an American fighter that had been useless at high altitude until they replaced the Allison engine with the British Merlin engine. And the Merlin, of course, is a high-altitude engine. Transformed it completely. and it could actually fly at 0.78. So here we had the answer. So General Doolittle put the others on different duties and used nothing but Mustangs for escort. And this was the finest escort fighter in the world, and saved the United States bomber force, frankly. And we did all that work for Doolittle at Farnborough. And he was very grateful. In fact, many years later, in fact, 1983, I think it was, when I was made an honorary fellow of the Society of Experimental Test Pilots, Doolittle was my host at that time. And he said, would I take back to Farnborough his everlasting thanks for the job we had done for him. So we helped the Americans just as they were helping us with our bomber force. So most of my time at Farnborough was spent on naval work, about half of my time, high-speed flight, mainly in the transonic range for the other half. These were my main things, with many other things, of course, but these were the accentuation points. When I arrived at Farnborough, I was in the naval aircraft flight, obviously, but I think because of the impression that I made, or so I'm told, with getting the Mozzie on the deck, they thought, we'll use this guy in the high-speed flight. And I was drafted into aerodynamics flight and in the high-speed flight. So I was working a lot on transonic work, and we realized with piston-engined aircraft, we were coming to the end of the road in our attempts. What the aviation industry wanted was to achieve supersonic speed. This was impossible on any piston-engined aircraft because of the drag of the propeller. So we realized we had reached the end of the road. We in Aeroflight at Farnborough had actually achieved the highest speed ever achieved in the world with a piston-engine fighter when we flew it up to 0.92, a Mach number of 0.92. It's never been beaten, that flight. So where were we going from there? Well, just as we reached the end of that road, a new road opened up, the first jet flights, the E-2839, etc. So we moved into the jet era, and all the accentuation on performance was now on jets. And we were spurred on by the realization that the Germans were ahead of us. Although Frank Whittle had invented the jet engine, the Germans, he had not been able to renew the patent on it, which he got the patent in 1930, and in 1935, when it came up for renewal, he couldn't afford the fee. So it became public knowledge, and the German embassy bought a huge number of copies of the patent, distributed them around their manufacturing industry libraries in Germany, and as a result, they had the first jet aircraft and the first twin jet aircraft before us flying. And of course, operationally, in mid-1944, they had two jets flying and a third on its way. In other words, the Messerschmitt 262 and the Arado 234, and with on its way the Heinkel 162. So it was a rude shock to us, this, and we realized we had got to do something to catch up. So there was huge accent on supersonic research. The one thing we lacked in this, and the reason we were lagging behind, was we did not have in the whole of the Allied aviation world, we did not have a single supersonic wind tunnel, and the Germans had quite a number of them. This is where we were badly lacking. All this was discovered after the capitulation of Germany, when we entered into Germany and found an Aladdin's cave of technology awaiting us. I mean, we were shocked to find how far advanced they were compared to ourselves. In the piston engine field, we were the top of the league. We were ahead of the world in research, in supersonic research. But when it came into the jet side, we had dropped behind because the Germans, having got the access to Whittle's work, then pressed on because the Nazis poured money into it, gave them all the money and all the facilities they required. Frank Whittle, well, I talked a lot about all this because one of the things we realized once we got the intelligence that the Germans were in the game, at first their original jets were working on the same principle as Frank's jet, and that is of centrifugal flow. And I said to Frank, look, the Germans started off with these, but we know now that in their more advanced aircraft, they've gone axial flow. I said, now you've known all about axial flow, Frank. Why didn't you go axial flow? And he said, because when I wanted to get my first jet aircraft to the RAF, I wanted them to be simple and reliable. And he said, that you cannot have at this stage with the axial flow. How right he was, because although the axial flow had more to offer in performance and in specific fuel consumption, the German axial flow engines had a total scrap life of 25 hours, whereas Frank's Wellens, which were going into the Meteor, had an overhaul life of 100 hours. So we were, from that point of view, he had achieved his objective, but at the expense of performance. And as you know, we eventually had to step up when we got the reliability into the engines, which he wanted. We then changed over to axial and remained with axial. I mean, the whole world's now on axial flow engines. Farnborough had started, and indeed was the first research establishment in the world to start work on compressibility and transonic testing, because the arrival of the Spitfire was a machine to generate be a catalyst, if you like, for this sort of work. And it started using the Spitfire 5 back in 1941. It had to halt a bit because the Spitfire didn't have the altitude to get, because this sort of work has to be done at high altitude. And eventually, with the increasing performance of the Spitfire, this went on until in 1943, Farnborough realized that perhaps they had the key to supersonic flight. So they issued a specification in 1943 for a supersonic research aircraft. And they chose Miles aircraft to design, with the help of Farnborough, the actual aircraft. Now, this might seem a surprising choice because Miles, pretty small aviation manufacturer, but there were two things in their favour. One, they had showed great innovation in design. And secondly, at that stage in the war, there wasn't any other manufacturer who could take it on. They were all so busy with full production for wartime. So it was stuck with Miles, and one has to say they made a very good job of it. Fundamentally, it had three basic characteristics, which the first one was it had a special engine to be built by Frank Whittle, which was a turbine with reheat and also an athergid element in it. And this was such that if we could get up to speed and the athergid took over, we believed we could reach 1,000 miles an hour. And the aircraft had also a biconvex wing, which was known as the Gillette wing, because it was literally in the form of a razor blade and was so sharp, both at the leading edge and the trailing edge, we actually had casualties amongst the ground crew cutting themselves on the wings. And thirdly, it had a flying tail. Now, a flying tail is normally you have a tailplane and an elevator, but with the flying tail, you have the tailplane and elevator are one solid piece, and the whole lot move. And you get so much better a moment from this that you can cope with the huge changes of trim in the transonic region. So it had everything. I was chosen to be the pilot on it for the simple reason that the fuselage at the pilot position was only 4 feet in diameter. And you couldn't get a pilot in there of more than 5 feet 8. So the fact that there was that aspect, the fact that I was in high-speed flight at Farnborough, and the then director decided that I would probably be the boy to do this. So I was with the M52 all from then on. That is, from then on, I'm saying from mid-1944. And when the time I joined it, that Miles had got quite a long way along the way. I would say they were in the 50% maybe of their preparation. They'd flown the wing, or rather fitted the wing to a small Falcon aircraft. It also then fitted the flying tail to the thing. So I was given the chance to fly both of these. And they hadn't a test pilot at Miles who was my size, but more importantly, they hadn't got a test pilot who had ever flown a jet aircraft or ever been in the transonic region of flight. Their pilots were ruled out on that basis. Now, we went on at a fair pace with this until we reached the end of 1945. And at that stage, in December 1945, when the aircraft was 92% ready for first flight, there arose a great problem that Frank Whittle, who was then running power jets, fell out with the establishment over the question of whether he or Rolls-Royce should produce production jet engines. It was ruled that Rolls-Royce should do it and Frank should stay on development work. He was so unhappy with this that he resigned from power jets along with 16 of his top engineers. So there was a full confrontation with the establishment. And whether this was the reason or not, the hard facts are, a month and a half later, the M52 was cancelled. This would be a way, if you like, of getting off at somebody who had cocked a snook at the establishment. But that is one conspiracy theory. There may be other reasons, and I've just written a book on the M52, and there are other possibilities that are put forward in that book. But proof of the pudding was that the sad thing about it, I should say, was, first of all, about 6 months before the cancellation, the Ministry of Aircraft Production had ordered that we receive a visit from the Americans, that everything be shown to them, nothing to be withheld from them whatsoever. They were even to be given copies of all the reports and copies of the design work, etc. And at the end of the day, I'm quite convinced that without this visit, the Americans would not have advanced through the sound barrier with the X-1 as early as they did. Because they had already, early on with the X-1, they ran into trouble at Mach 0.94. They couldn't control the change of trim on the aircraft. So suddenly, within 3 days, they produced a flying tail, which Bell had been building up. And Bell were amongst the people who visited Miles. So you can read into that what you will, but there is no doubt that something was afoot there. Then, while we were ruled out by the cancellation, and I had already been given the date for the first flight, which was to be October 1946 at Boscombe Down. So we were ruled out of it. The X-1 went its merry way, but we later dropped a model from a Mosquito over the Scilly Isles, and it was radio-controlled with a small jet engine in it, but exactly otherwise a replica of the M52, and it achieved a Mach number of 1.38. So we can conclude that we were on the right track for supersonic speed. Now, Mrs. Thatcher, or Baroness Thatcher as she now is, was so upset when she came into power by what had happened that she issued a white paper on the subject, saying it was one of the most disastrous decisions and had led to us losing our position of prestige in aviation. So it's a sad story. This is the terrible thing about it. There was no prior notification given either to Miles or to Farnborough. And I was hopping mad, frankly, when I heard the decision, and went round to see Ben Lockspizer, who was almost my next-door neighbour, and at Farnborough, and of course who was chairman of the supersonic committee that made the decision. And I got no change out of him at all. And frankly, I think he was deeply concerned, as I know Barnes Wallis was, about the safety of the pilot and such, because we had an ejection capsule system for the pilot on the M52, which was a little complex, but I was quite happy with it. Seemed to me to be practical, and we had made tests on it, and it had been passed as fit for the second flight. The first flight was merely to be a proof of concept, and the second flight was to be the actual attack on supersonic flight. So we were approaching it in the right way, but as I say, I got no change out of Sir Ben, nor did I get any explanation as to why the cancellation took place. One can only assume that we would have accepted the prestige of it in the same way the Americans have, perhaps with less ballyhoo, but obviously it was a big milestone in the history of flight, as it's turned out to be for the Americans. And I think it was certainly well within our grasp and taken away, and this is the galling thing, for a reason that up to today we are not sure why it was done. I had spent quite a bit of time in Germany, of course. Not a lot, but I had certainly got to know the people fairly well. I was an admirer of the Germans in the sense I admired their discipline. They like to be told what to do. They don't like to be left rudderless, so to speak. And also, they have a huge capacity for work. Their industrial capacity is colossal. When I went, the country was just beginning to show signs of recovering from the Treaty of Versailles. I think this was a terrible mistake made by the Allies in World War I, because the Treaty of Versailles achieved very little other than taking away the pride of the country, Germany. When you deprive a country of its pride, you are asking for big trouble. And we got it, because they'll do almost anything to get that pride back. And if somebody appears that offers to lead them along that path, be he good or evil, they'll follow him. And in every country there's an element of evil. And the sad thing is, if it is allowed to get power, you'll go down the road that Nazi Germany went. And I think this was a disaster, because I liked the people. I had many good friends in Germany. But of course, I was rocked back on my heels and changed a lot of my opinion after what I saw in Belsen. And whatever you say or think about a nation, that sort of behavior is totally unforgivable. There'll always be an argument as to how much the Germans knew. But I think most of them had an idea there was a lot of evil going on. We were prepared to move in, and our remit was firstly to find and, if necessary, remove their supersonic wind tunnels. That was the first priority. Second priority was to track down their advanced aircraft, and if they were flyable, although I must say we didn't think they would be, we expected them to destroy, vandalize them all, but if we did find them, to test them. Thirdly, to interrogate their leading manufacturers and test pilots, and to get as much data from them as to how they arrived at this position. The biggest surprise we had was to walk in and find, although almost, I would say, certainly 80%, if not more, of the piston-engine aircraft had been vandalized. The jets and the rocket aircraft were left totally untouched. Why? I've asked myself this many times, and I can only assume it was because they were so proud of their achievement that they wanted us to see this and see what might have been if they could have continued the war. But they couldn't continue for the simple reason, even though they had these wonderful aircraft, they were running out of pilots, and running out of fuel. And also, the axial flow engines were very complex and production of them was slow. So they were on a losing wicket anyway. But I think they wanted us to see what they had achieved. Having been taken there, I wasn't really sure why this brigadier wanted me to go with him. But they were a medical group, this army group. And I thought that when I knew we were going to Belsen, we'd have to fight our way in. But it wasn't like that at all. Because in the background, somewhere, a truce had been made with Germany about Belsen, and the Germans' army, with a Hungarian unit with them, were actually guarding the concentration camp. So the guards couldn't leave it. I don't think they were interested in saving the guards from their eventual execution. The reason for trying to contain it was, in the camp we found 20,000 cases of typhus. And I think the Germans were very frightened of this getting out into the population, which at that stage in the war would have been disastrous. So the deal was we could come in unopposed and we would take over and try to quell this typhus situation, and the Germans would retreat back to their units to continue the fight against us. Strange arrangement, but that's how it was. And what we saw there, indescribable. The piles of bodies were bad enough, but it was the stench of the place that I found so terrible. And of course, we were a little worried about catching typhus. We all wore surgical masks, but there we are. And when I interrogated these two people, the male and the female commandant, Kramer knew chips were down, he was going to be executed. He could see no way out, so he didn't shilly-shally around. He told it as it was, pretty well. Well, firstly, she was the mistress of Joseph Kramer at this stage. But dealing with him first, he was a monster, obviously, but he was a realist. And he knew the chips were down and that there was no way out for him. So he was straightforward and in interrogation told us just more or less how things were. Now, Margarita was a very different cup of tea altogether, because she had been the female camp commandant at Auschwitz and was, of course, well known there for her exceptional cruelty. She really was the worst human being I have ever met or am ever likely to meet. And she fled from Auschwitz when the Russians were about to overrun the place and came to Belsen, where, as I say, she became the camp commandant's mistress and therefore the female camp commandant. And she showed no emotion at all. She was cruel to the nth degree. And when I interrogated her, the brigadier, I said, "What do you want me to ask her?" And he said, "Ask her if she had her time over again, would she do this, or what would be her attitude?" So I asked her this, and she wouldn't reply. She just sat in a chair and wouldn't reply. So he said, "Keep on asking her." Now, I asked her, I'd say, about 3 times. And she didn't reply at all. Then suddenly leapt to her feet, gave the Heil Hitler salute, and called out Heil Hitler, and then sat down, refused to answer anything. So you would say she had no remorse whatsoever. And I believe when she was hung by Albert Pierpoint, who was over there after we had been to Bilston to execute a large number of the guards there. Even when he put the bag over her head, she showed not a whittle of emotion. So these are the sort of people one can find in a nation, I guess. We were frankly shocked to find how far ahead of us they were. Wind tunnels to start with. In the whole of the Allied aviation world, there wasn't a single supersonic wind tunnel. And this is where we were lucky, the country had been divided into occupation zones. This was done before this capitulation. And we had a zone rich in research centres. The main aviation research centres were in the British zone. And the one at Fulkenrode had 3 supersonic wind tunnels. And it was quite astonishing, but later on, when I say supersonic, they were just supersonic, about 1.1, 1.2 Mach number. But down in Bavaria, we were alerted that there was a wind tunnel there, which had been originally in Peenemünde for Werner von Braun. He had had it built. And when we looked at it, it had been removed from Peenemünde because of the bombing there, and this had an airstream of Mach 4.4. Quite incredible. And also the airstream was heated in order to give true supersonic results. So this had been started to being built in 1939. So there was just streets ahead of us in this area. And if I think things had gone on unabated a bit further, I do think Germany would have been the first to have broken the sound barrier, because they had a project which was at the DFS, which was the gliding school. It wasn't a glider, but they did a lot of work on streamlined bodies, and it was being built by Arado, the manufacturer, and it was so far advanced that the Russians realized that they must have been very near ready to go supersonic. They took 50 of the Arado scientists working on it, plus the pilot, lock, stock and barrel, and the airplane back to Russia, and kept them for years. And we believe there is a possibility that the aircraft did go supersonic, but the Russians would never admit it because, of course, it was flown by a German pilot. Now that's a bit of guesswork, but based on some pretty good information. The Me-262, without any question, was the most formidable aircraft of World War II. For this reason, it had a lot of innovatory features and a quantum jump in performance. The innovatory features were, of course, primarily swept-back wings. Secondly, axial flow jet engine. Thirdly, very heavy firepower, 4 30mm cannon. Strangely enough, it had no ejection seat fitted, although the Germans were well advanced in ejection seat technology, but they didn't have an ejection seat fitted. But it was the performance that rattled us, because at this time, in the war, The top Allied fighter was the Spitfire Mark 14, with a top speed of 446 miles an hour. When I tested the ME-262 at Farnborough, it had a top speed of 568 miles an hour, 125 miles an hour faster than our fastest fighter. With this sort of fighter, you could conduct combat totally on your terms. If you didn't want to engage, you could go off and leave everybody standing. If you did want to engage, you didn't dogfight with a fighter like this. You made slashing runs at them, blasted at them with your 4 30mm cannon, and then got out of it. Of course, it was not meant mainly for fighter to fighter. It was fighter to bomber. And it had slight disadvantage here because, like us with our first jet, we'd forgotten one thing. That was how to slow them down. And we'd forgotten to fit dive brakes, and so had the Germans. So let's imagine this fighter taking on a B-17 Flying Fortress. It would come in at very high speed. Now, the 30mm cannon had an effective range of 650 yards, but it was inaccurate beyond that range. So you would close to 600 yards, open fire, but your closing speed was so high because you didn't have any air brakes that you had to break off at 200 yards in case you collided with a target. So you had a total firing time of 2 seconds. Now, in that time, you can only point your airplane at the target and shoot at random. If you had dive brakes, you could increase that time from 2 seconds to 4 seconds. And in 4 seconds, you can sight and fire. It would have made quite a bit of difference, maybe not a huge amount. And of course, later on, they introduced, fortunately, at the very end of the war, a fearsome weapon called the R4M air-to-air rocket. And this was fitted in racks of 12 under each wing. And I've seen a picture of it fired against a Marauder medium bomber. And when those rockets hit, 1 minute you have a bomber there, next minute you have confetti. It is just total annihilation. It really was fearsome. Now, the Arado 234, different propositions, straight wing, same engines, but a reconnaissance bomber. But it was so fast, even with straight wings, that it could outrun any Allied fighter. And we know that it had taken, because we found the pictures, taken reconnaissance pictures over Great Britain, operating out of Norway. And it was that fast, as I say, it could fly in with impunity and take the pictures and get out again. Was beautifully streamlined and just a fine bit of wonderful construction. It was easier to keep serviceable than the Messerschmitt 262. And we flew the 262 a lot, but I tended to fly the Arado more because we were getting more information on the engine out of it. That's what we really wanted at that stage. The 163, in my opinion, at the end of the day, was a tool of desperation. It was not, I don't think, operationally effective. Its operational record is this. In its entire operational time, it killed 16 Allied aircraft for the loss of 10 of its own. But the other side of the coin was they lost over 40 with operational accidents due to the high volatility of the fuels used, which were extremely dangerous. It had, again, innovation was the name of the game here. You had swept wings on this. It was semi-tailless. It had a vertical tail, but no horizontal tail. It had elevons for both longitudinal and lateral control. It had a rocket motor, which was unique in this sense. Rockets have been tried in aircraft for years, both solid fuel and liquid fuel, but all had the same problem. When you lit the touch paper, you sit back and there's nothing you can do about it till it burns itself out. Here was a rocket produced which was throttleable. It could be throttled to either idle, cruise, or full power. It also had a skid landing, but the main problem with it was the fuels were incredibly volatile. Its main fuel was concentrated hydrogen peroxide. Now, I know nothing more explosive, with perhaps the exception of nitroglycerin, than concentrated hydrogen peroxide. And you had, under full power, 120 seconds of flight. That was all. Every landing was a dead stick landing. But you had to absolutely ensure that no fuel was left in the system. You had a jettison system on the aircraft, but sometimes it didn't work. If you landed with as much as a cupful of fuel in the aircraft, the impact of touchdown would cause a violent explosion that would destroy both the aircraft and the crew, the pilot, of course. So this was the danger. Another side of it was danger to the pilot in combat. When I flew the 163, I found that it had quite a comfortable pilot seat, and it had arms rather like these are, rounded. I thought this is very comfortable, but then I realised both these arms were hydrogen peroxide fuel tanks. And I said to the designer of the rocket, that is, Dr. Walter, I was in no danger of combat damage because I was flying it after the war was over, but what would happen if a bullet went through one of these tanks? And he said, well, we have done tests. And he said, even if you are using a non-organic suit, that if a bullet goes through and fuel leaks, it would take 9 minutes to melt the pilot. So that's the sort of horror side of that. And you can see where the accidents obviously occurred. Well, he was picked up by the Americans, so he wasn't in our care at all. But we, in the American occupation zone, they had a team doing precisely what we were doing in the Havilland mission. And in the whole of the American occupation zone, they hadn't a single Arado 234. And they were very keen to get one. So our government said they could have 2 from the lot at Norway, because we had almost a wing of them up there. So they were given 2. Then they came back to us and said, the Secretary of State said, we would very much like to have another 2. And I hummed and hawed over this purely as a game and said to them, well, we might be able to arrange it, but we would like a quid pro quo. And they said, well, what are you after? And I said, interrogation rights with Goering. So they started a hum and haw. Anyway, about a month went past, and eventually they came up and said, okay, it's a deal. And we gave them 2 more, and I got access to Goering for an hour. And would you like to hear about it? He was in a hotel near Luxembourg, under American captivity. And he was really being held there prior to the Nuremberg trials, which were approaching quite fast. Because I interrogated him, I think, if I recollect, it was the 16th of June, 1945. And I was given an hour, told I mustn't ask him any political questions because of the Nuremberg trials coming up, but I could ask him only aviation questions. Well, when he was brought in to the interrogation room, his clothes were hanging on him because the Americans had weaned him off drugs, and he'd lost a lot of weight. And he was looking po-faced, frankly, because I think he'd been interrogated up to here. And then the American invigilating officer, who had to be present during these interrogations, said to him, "You're going to be interrogated for the first time by a pilot." And his attitude changed completely. He smiled, and he didn't offer to shake hands. Well, I wouldn't have shaken hands with him anyway. But he was very affable. And frankly, I found him a charismatic rogue, frankly. He was highly intelligent, there's no doubt about that, as he demonstrated at the Nuremberg trials. But anything I asked him, he would deliberate for a little while before answering, but answer direct, no shilly-shallying around. And maybe the key question that would interest people was I asked him what he thought the outcome of the Battle of Britain was, to which he replied that it was a draw. And I said, well, how did you arrive at that conclusion? And he said, well, if you look at the official casualty lists on both sides, he said there isn't much between them. Now, that's not an unreasonable statement when you look at the casualty lists. And he said, secondly, we withdrew. We were not defeated, we withdrew because Hitler ordered all the air units back to train for Operation Barbarossa, which was the invasion of Russia. Now, that is also factually true. Now, I would not like to tell the RAF that he had reached a conclusion which was not unreasonable, because clearly, as far as we were concerned, victory was 100% on our side. But his reasoning was not too bad if you consider it all. About 1947, I'd been at Farnborough by this time 3 years. I was going on my 4th. And I was beginning to think it was the end of the war and I should be doing something. And Sidney Cam of Hawkers was interested in having me join the firm after Bill Humble retired. And I went for an interview with him, and we had more or less said that if I could get my release, this would be on the cards. So I then approached the Navy, and they said, oh, Farnborough says you can't be released. So I said, well, why not? And they said, well, you're engaged in one or two top secret projects, and they've got to be carried through to fruition. And I said, well, you really are penalising me for this, aren't you? And they said, well, we will try and compensate you by offering you a permanent commission. And I said, right, I'm prepared to accept that. And it was as straightforward as that. I have always admired the US Navy with the way they use aircraft carriers. And I was at Farnborough at a very exciting time of carrier innovation, where we evolved the three major things. Firstly, there was the steam catapult, which could throw heavier aircraft off at much higher end speeds and with much less adverse acceleration on the pilot. In other words, with the normal cordite catapult, you went off, there was a colossal bang, and you were a shock, and then you were thrown off. With the steam catapult, you accelerate up to the max, so a max G. So it's quite comfortable. But the end result is wonderful. You get tremendous speed at the end, and you can take off much heavier weights. So that was a big innovation. And of course, it's using the ship's steam as the source. Secondly, of course, and above all, was the invention of the angled deck. Now that came about as a result of experiments done on what is called the flexible deck. This is landing an undercarriageless aircraft on a rubber deck. And we had a problem with getting the aircraft off the rubber deck in time to land on the next aircraft. So, ideally, you wanted a clear landing lane and a clear parking area, rather. And during conversation, while we were discussing this in general, the chairman of the meeting, who was a captain in the Royal Navy, happened to make a doodle on a piece of paper showing going off the angle. But it didn't occur to him. It must have occurred to him, but he didn't process it any further to the meeting. He just, left it. But sitting opposite him, thank God, was the head of the Naval Aircraft Division at Farnborough, who saw this, and it clicked with him immediately. This is a practical solution that could be actually incorporated in a carrier. That's how it evolved. And I was just about my time just after leaving Farnborough. The Americans had asked if I could go to America, to their test centre at Patuxent River. And Farnborough said, well, take the drawings and the details of the angled deck to them, and that'll be a nice introduction for you. And that's how it was. And of course, they were delighted and seized on it, and as only the Americans can do, worked with lightning speed to get it to be a practical idea. I'd been in the jet flight, and it was all very top secret at this time, and the then boss of the outfit said to me, look, he was very interested in the Navy. I always had a good rapport with him. And he said, you should be thinking of getting one of these onto carriers. And I said, well, can I have a look over the stable to see what we've got? And there were 4 jets at the time. There was the E-28-39, the Gloucester, our first jet. There was only one left. So this was ruled out because it was really an engine test bed. There was the Meteor, which was twin-engined and really too big for the job. There was the Bell Aerocomet, the American one, which we didn't want to touch because it was sluggish and it was their aircraft anyway. And then they left us with the only other alternative, which was called, at that time, the de Havilland Spider Crab, which became the Vampire. So that it was almost, if you like, Hobson's choice. And we selected that. The Vampire was a very, very docile aircraft, easy to fly, and all handling characteristics, very benign. So I thought there was no problem there at all. The only problem we had was at that stage in jet development, the acceleration of the jet engine and the deceleration was very poor. For example, it took on the aircraft that were fitted with British and German engines and American, all at that time we were all suffering from the same problem, slow acceleration. For example, the Meteor took 15 seconds to go from zero idle to full power. Now, in a deck landing, if you suddenly need more lift because you've let yourself get too slow, you need instantaneous lift, which you get from a piston engine aircraft with air screw. And throttle is... So what we wanted was throttle reaction on a jet like you have on a piston engine. That was inevitably coming, and in fact only took about 9 months to come after we did the first landing. But our big boost to all this was we were going to beat the Americans to it, which we did by 9 months. Huge advantage in the jet, view. You've no engine, propeller and everything sticking out in front of you. Otherwise, the technique has to change completely in this sense. The essence of deck landing is lift control. And you get that on a piston engine aircraft by throttle movement. If you want lift, you just push up the throttle, the air screw will rev up, and you get lift from the wash from the propeller. If you want drag, which you do if you're getting too fast, you need drag, you just throttle back, the propeller finds up, and you get drag from the propeller. In a jet, the only way you can get lift is by accelerating and getting more speed, and the only way you can get drag is from air brakes. So it's different technique altogether. Well, at the end of the war, of course, everybody had to think again, and what are we going to do now? And the emphasis obviously went on to civil aviation. And the inevitable route at first was to civilianize military aircraft, like Lancaster was civilized into the Lancastrian, and things like that. The Wellington, the Warwick was civilized, the Warwick rather was civilianized. But we wanted a new breed of civil aircraft altogether, and our first one, which was the Avro Tudor. Now, Roy Chadwick, the designer of Avro, had designed a masterly aircraft in the Lancaster, and he designed the Tudor, and we expected the same sort of standard, and what we got was a grave disappointment. It was a very poor aircraft indeed. In fact, we reckoned it had 14 basic faults when it arrived at Farnborough, and some of them were dangerous faults. So the start was not good. But once we got into the swing of things, the Americans really forced ahead of us in this area, I think. And because they had really been preparing themselves for the end of the war a bit earlier than we had. The Russians weren't in the game because the Russians had built engines for combat aircraft with only a life of 100 hours. They reckoned there was no point in putting an elaborate engine into a combat aircraft that was going to be destroyed or wouldn't last much more than 100 hours. As a result, they finished up at the end of the war with no engines that anybody would dream of putting in a civil aircraft. So they were left at the post, so to speak. But our main fight was with the Americans in trying to capture the civil market. So we thought a bit slow off the mark until, of course, the Comet was devised by de Havillands, and this was moving into the jet side of civil traffic, and but then it ran into this disaster period, which set it back very heavily. But we did well, for example, on turboprops with the Vickers Viscount. And we were making good progress generally. But I would say the accidents on the Comet set us back quite a bit, because the investigation as to what happened there had to be thorough and therefore took rather a long time. And that put the brakes on us rather badly. We realized that here was a new environment for civilian passengers. They had always been taken through at low to medium level, and sometimes subjected to a fair amount of disturbance in low-level clouds, but nothing like the thunderheads you get up at high altitude. But when we reverted to jet airliners, they had no option but to fly at high altitude. So penetration of thunderclouds had to be looked at, but also a new phenomenon that was occurring up there called clear air turbulence. This is when you are going along, visibility perfectly, suddenly you find yourself in very heavy turbulence because you are in a jet stream. And so that had to be investigated. Thunderhead penetration had to be investigated. And I think that's one of the most uncomfortable tests I've ever made in my life, was penetrating a thunderhead in a Spitfire. We chose a Spitfire because it has such structural integrity that it'd be unlikely to break up in these things. But it is a frightening experience. You are tossed around like a little light toy. And in addition, you're getting the full visual entertainment. Elmers fire around the prop, lightning strikes on the fuselage, and lightning strikes that destroy your vision for looking at the instruments from dark suddenly to full light. And you really cannot control the aircraft as one does in normal conditions. All you can do is sit and try and keep the artificial horizon level. And you're at the mercy of the wind shears that are occurring in those thunderheads. And sometimes you find yourself going up at a rate of 1,000 feet a minute, and a couple of seconds later you'll be going down at a similar rate. It is a very scary thing. And of course, when you apply that sort of behaviour onto an airliner, the structural demands on a civil airliner become huge. And I think the civil world, if you like, the aviation side of civil passenger flying, hadn't realised quite what they were up against at these very high altitudes. When you get into test flying, you're well aware you're in a risk business, and it is just part of the job. But after a while, you realise if you're going to stay in the job any length of time, you better think about survivability. And the fatality rate at Farnborough amongst test pilots in aerodynamics flight was very high, 25%. And I believe part of the reason for this was we were in a pressure pot because of the war. The results wanted to be provided yesterday, so to speak. I mean, today now, where you can go up and you maybe are going to test an airplane in about its behaviour at speed. So today you go up maybe at 5 mile an hour or 10 mile an hour jumps, and you just go up and do them, send it back to telemetered back. 10 minutes later you're told, okay, you can go on to the next 5 miles an hour. In war, there was nothing like that, and we had no time to take small jumps like that. Whereas in the modern way, as I say, the jumps may be 10 miles an hour. In those days, they were 20 to 50 miles an hour. And in consequence, we ran into trouble. That trouble had to be accepted in the interests of speed, getting the results to the operational crews. And because of this, our fatality rate got big. So my view was that a lot of these fatalities were due to lack of preparation by the test pilots. We were jumping from one type of aircraft to another. Maybe I've done as many as 8 different types in one day. But the normal would be about maybe 3 different types a day. But they're very different. And you have got to know everything about that aircraft in case there is a big problem with it in the job you're going to do. So preparation is vital. That requires time. And a lot of pilots prefer to use their time drinking at the bar. And this, I think, is what caused a lot of our problems. They were familiar with the aircraft when everything was normal. But when an emergency occurred, and there are many emergencies that can happen, they hadn't boned up on what to do in these emergencies. Now, I always carried a knee pad with me, one to take test results, but on the other knee I had a pad with the emergency drill for the likely possibilities that could happen. And although I kept the main details of the airplane in my head, if an emergency occurred, I had immediately a reference on my knee as to what to do. In other words, for example, how to lower the undercarriage in an emergency, or how to feather the propellers, something like that, you know. And I think preparation was contributed a large percentage to my survival. But another thing is, I think my stature contributed to my survival, because it's very noticeable that very tall people in airplanes run into a lot of bigger troubles than small pilots. For example, I was told by a World War I pilot who had many crashes and survived them. He said, when you realise you're going to crash, get your feet off the rudder bars and tuck them under your seat. Tuck your legs under your seat. And because it's the front end of you that are going to take the impact. And this saved me once on a crash with the Messerschmitt 163. And also, I think a pilot ejecting, where in ejection, if you're tall, compression of the spine is much more likely with a person over 5'8" than it is with a small person. The fact that I would say that I made my preparation paramount, and nature helped me with the other bit, that I and a little bit of luck thrown in. I survived and had a good chance, and an analyst in 1980 something or other looked at my career and said I had 11 death-threatening accidents. So to survive those, I can't complain. After 6 years of test flying at Farnborough, and the Lordships of the Admiralty decided I better go back to operational flying. It comes as a bit of a shock to the system. But I found it very easy to integrate. I mean, the flying was much simpler, but what I enjoyed tremendously was the camaraderie of squadron life. And we were in the Mediterranean at that time, and flying from what I call a fleet carrier. Wasn't a full-size carrier, it was the middle size, and in Sea Furies. And then I was able to concentrate on another aspect of things. You forget that naval flying is very different from Air Force flying. You're in an environment which is basically hostile, the sea. If anything happens to you, you're flying single-engine aircraft too. If anything happens, a ditching is inevitable. That is not an easy thing to do, particularly if the sea is rough. So the Air Force fighter pilot goes out, has his combat, comes back to his airfield. In the Navy, you have your combat, and then you've got to find your way home, because unlike fighting over land, you are not allowed to contact your carrier in case you give its position away, or it gives its position away by replying to you. So sometimes after combat, you're quite disorientated, and you've got to have kept in your head some idea of the dead reckoning you've got to make to get back to your carrier. And then when you get back, you have the hazard of deck landing, particularly if your aircraft's been damaged in combat. All these things to learn about. And all these were brought home to me that refreshed my mind about the whole thing. That's the hard side of it, but on the nice side was we had time and we were picked to be an aerobatic team to give air shows when we got back to UK. That I thoroughly enjoyed, and I was fortunate enough to lead the Navy's piston engine aerobatic team, and then later one of their jet teams. So I've always enjoyed that aspect of flying, this formation aerobatics. The F-86 was one of the most delightful jets. In fact, I count it as the most delightful to handle because it had what is called, in the E version, which had a flying tail, almost perfect harmony of control. Now, harmony of control is what binds a pilot with his aircraft. And what you mean by harmony of control is you want light lateral control, good rate of roll, medium light fore and aft control, and reasonably heavy directional control. If you have these three things blended to perfection, then you feel you and the airplane are one, and you're part of it. And this, the Sabre has. Absolutely. And also I have a great affection for it because it was the first aircraft in which I ever went supersonic. And the F-86A, which was the very early version. It was easier in the later version, like the E with the flying tail. But I have a tremendous affection and respect for the F-86A. It really did exactly what I thought would happen. I'd done so much transonic flying that when I actually took the F-86 through the barrier, I realised that this was inevitably what was coming with the work we were doing at Farnborough. If we had had the supersonic wind tunnel data to give us the design capability to have an airplane like this. And it exhibited everything. The only surprise was, because one hadn't experienced it before, was when you got through the barrier, everything suddenly became dead smooth. And all this vibration and porpoising and nose down trim effect all disappeared. And you were in smooth air. Now, when you came back through the barrier in reverse to become subsonic, you get a little of that in reverse. So that, of course, I'd never experienced either. So it was adding to one's, if you like, CV. Brodie was in the depth of Wales, and of course it was fairly isolated part of the country and subject to very nasty weather. It was coastal, and we were on the top of a fairly high cliff, right at the edge of the sea, and these sudden low sea mists came in and completely blanked out the airfield quite often. So that was quite a difficult place to operate on. There were diversions, but we were operating jets, not piston engine, And with jets, you never have an excess of fuel. And to get to your diversion, you really needed fairly early warning that things were going adrift. So we had to keep a very alert weather watch on operations there to feel they were secure. And to get back, we had to do some things and devise new systems. For example, with the GCA, which is the ground control approach, we had to use frequently in the bad weather there, but we had so many jets in the air at one time, I started getting them to come in on the GCA information, 2 at a time. So the wingman had to depend totally on his leader to get him down. Of course, he hears everything that's going on the radio, but he's going to have to depend on his leader to get him onto the ground. And we were operating up to cloud bases of 200 feet, which is pretty tight. Ah, right, yes. Yes, one day we had a report. Air traffic control alerted me that aircraft were reporting seeing a flying saucer. And when one looked up anywhere on the airfield, it was clear to the naked eye there was something like a saucer up there. So I said, right, I'll take a vampire up and have a look at it. And went up to the absolute ultimate ceiling of the vampire, which was just almost 40,000 feet, and it was still above me. I didn't get close enough to put my hand on my heart and say what it was. So I have a very open mind on what it could have been. A radio sonde balloon. It could have been something else. I just was not sure. And anyway, we recorded it, but I have an open mind on flying saucers. When I returned from my posting in Germany to the Admiralty, I at first was made Deputy Director of the Gunnery Division. Of course, when they say gunnery, these weren't the 16-inch guns on battleships. They were, from my point of view, it was air gunnery, particularly the fitting of weapons to helicopters, which was a fairly new science. And also we were getting into the nuclear side at that stage too. Not the dropping of strategic bombs, but of tactical bombs, the smaller ones. And even things like nuclear depth charges. So it was a very interesting period, but I had a year of that, which was enough, and then became the Deputy Director of Air Warfare. Now, this was a very interesting period because we were coming up to the time when we were proposing to have a real, if you like, spring cleaning of the Fleet Air Arm. We were wanting a new carrier, and we wanted new aircraft, including both fixed-wing and rotary-wing. The aircraft carrier we were to, obviously, was the design would be that had to be done by the actual naval architects, but we were responsible for the layout of the flight deck. Now, we could build in all our new innovations, steam catapults, sort of angled decks, of course, and mirror landing sites. So that was very exciting. But the aircraft was the real battlefield, because there was a tendency in the Ministry of Defence at this time to ask both the Air Force and ourselves to use the same aircraft. And they were trying hard to push onto us the a VTOL version, the P1154, which was an increased size Harrier, really. And to me, not a very impressive performance. Had a top speed of Mach 1.6. I, frankly, am not over-enthused about VTOL, as pure VTOL as such. The penalties you have to pay for this facility are huge. We in the Navy turned to VTOL, or we were turned by force majeure. When our projected carrier was cancelled, we had to find a way to survive. We went onto a form of small carrier, which for some reason fooled the politicians by being called through-deck cruisers. And these had such small flight decks, you could only operate VTOL aircraft. Now, this was happening ahead, if you like, looming on the horizon, but we were still in the big carrier game. We still had the Ark Royal, the Hermes, and the Eagle. So we were still in the big carrier game. And I was quite determined I was not going to have VTOL. I wanted to have the fastest performance aircraft we could have. And looming on the horizon at that time was this wonderful aircraft, the McDonnell Phantom. And twin-engined, which is another good thing to have in naval aviation if you're spending your time over the lonely sea. And tremendous performance, but above all, tremendous weapon carrying ability. And in its development, it broke almost every world record for performance that you can think of. And I got support from unexpected quarters, in the sense that the chief scientist at that time supported me, and this was, I think, what tipped the scales, really, because he is the advisor to the Admiralty, and I was all for going for the performance, weight carrying, as I said. This offered us everything. Safety factor, too. He particularly fastened on to the safety factor of the Twin Phantom. When we actually got it, it was everything I'd hoped for. I flew it in America, I flew it here, I flew it onto an American carrier, and it was superb. Now, if we had had that Phantom continued to, we were employing it on the Ark Royal. But just before the Falklands crisis arose, the Ark Royal was scrapped. The Phantom brought out of service. We were left, therefore, with the Harrier as our main strike aircraft for the Falklands campaign. Now, what this meant was the carrier, for safety reasons, had to stand 70 miles off the Falkland Islands. You send your VTOL aircraft to the Falklands for combat air patrol over the Falklands. By the time it's got the 70 miles, done half an hour over the Falklands, circling around, waiting for Argentinian aircraft to come, then 70 miles back again. It is almost out of fuel. And if we'd had the Phantom in that situation, it would have gone not sitting on a cap out of the Falklands, it would have gone halfway to Argentina to kill the aircraft coming out to raid the Falklands en route. And I spoke to the commander of the Falklands campaign afterwards, and he felt that if he had had Phantoms plus AEW aircraft, which had also been scrapped, I may say, just before the Falklands, this battle could have been won in probably a fortnight or a month. So everything, the timing was absolutely catastrophic from that point of view. That the two aircraft we wanted vanished at just the critical time, and we were left with VTOL aircraft and no AEW. There is nothing accelerates technology, of course, like a war. And we entered it, as you so rightly say, largely a biplane air force, and emerged from it as a monoplane air force with a considerable improvement in performance. I mean, to jump from the Gladiator, which was the best of the biplane fighters, to the Spitfire is an immense jump, a huge jump. And of course, we can't be thankful enough that we just happened to have a genius that produced the Spitfire, which for reasons that are almost unthinkable, still goes faster than modern aircraft like the Mustang. And these were more modern, I'm talking at the beginning of the war. And we graduated, when you realize that started with the Spitfire 1, and from there graduated right through many, many marks, improving all the time, improving performance, increasing weight, until we arrive at the ultimate with the Seafire 47, the contra-rotating propeller Spitfire, which weighed twice as much as the original Spitfire and could actually carry the equivalent of 32 passengers in its weightlifting capability. It is incredible, the progress that was made because of the pressure of war. And, of course, fortunately, in the middle of it all, there came the one factor that we had no control over. That was the genius of Whittle arriving on the scene and coming at absolutely the right time to transform us from the piston engine era into the jet era. Couldn't have happened at a more perfect time. So the logic of it is absolutely understandable. What would not have been understandable was, without war, that pressure would have taken, to achieve what we did, would probably have taken maybe 20 years. Instead, compressed into 5 years. It, as I say, the big advantage was the delight of view, which is always a difficult issue. At that stage, we needed a little more perfection out of the jet engine, but that was purely because of the earliness in the history of the jet engine. But it led us into a new world, and piston engines were forever off the shopping list, if you like to put it that way. And this was going to all occur very, very rapidly. One has to remember there was a danger at one stage in the movement from piston to jet of trying to rush it all too early. The Americans did rush theirs too early, and they found out that when they got to the Korean War, the kind of aircraft they wanted in the Korean War was not the jet fighter, it was the piston engine fighter, because that type of war they were carrying out there required that. Fortunately, we hadn't rushed into that stage, and we had, for the Korean War, two of the best aircraft we could ever have had, the Sea Fury and the Seafire 47. So luck was with us there. Then things, of course, changed for Vietnam, but we weren't involved, of course, there. Although it was old-fashioned by what was about to happen soon, it was the best of the breed and a delight to fly, and from the pilot's point of view, an aerobatic gem. And that was the thing that stayed in the mind. It was so manoeuvrable, but of course, totally out of date for what was coming. Rugged, built for the harsh environment of carrier operations, very reliable, and it showed us the easy way to deck land, introducing the sting hook into deck landing. So a great asset, and arrived at the right time when Britain was, or the Fleet Air Arm was running out of high-performance aircraft. Product of genius, and remarkable, and we never suspected it would be the greatest transonic aircraft of all the piston-engined aircraft. It was one of the first, and yet, in spite of new technology, that shape that was originated in it remained as the best shape of all. And as I said earlier, it achieved an almost unbelievable Mach number of 0.92. Britain in World War II had three great aircraft: the Lancaster, the Mosquito, and the Spitfire. The Mosquito was in the middle range. They spanned the three things: a single-seat fighter, and then you got into the twin two-seat. Could be almost anything: a fighter, a bomber, a photo reconnaissance. It was a gift from heaven at the right time for Britain. To me, it was a flying test bed, and it was exciting, inevitably. What could not be exciting about Britain's first jet? Docile, very easy to fly, and for its stage in jet development, incredibly reliable. Ju-88 was outstanding aircraft. As I described the three top British, the Germans had three top ones. These were the Focke-Wulf 190, the Ju-88, and the Messerschmitt 262. Ju-88 was asked to do a multitude of things, many, many roles. It excelled in every one of them, and in one form was actually faster than Germany's fastest fighter, piston-engine fighter, let's say. So I had the highest respect for it. Lancaster, another product of genius. It was You just got into the cockpit of the Lancaster and you felt filled with confidence that you could do what the other bombers had failed to do with this particular machine. And strangely enough, whereas the previous bombers, the Halifax and the Stirling, the four-engine bombers, had to have two pilots, suddenly you found the Lancaster with one pilot. But you felt so much confidence in it, it was no problem. 163, as I said, was a tool of desperation with a poor operational record, and I consider its contribution to aviation was that it had so many innovatory features on it. But strangely enough, at the end of the war, it was the aircraft that influenced world aviation thinking more than any other unit. The Me-262 is a great contribution again, quantum jump in performance. It took us into a new era of high speed. It was a beautiful airplane to fly, but it had very, very sensitive jet engines, and they were temperamental. And when they were acting correctly, you had a great airplane on your hands. When they were temperamental, you had quite a difficult airplane on your hands. That was a huge airplane, and I enjoyed flying it for the simple reason it was, again, up with the state of the art at the end of the war, and it was so solid and so well armed and had such good performance. I felt there was a great air of impregnability about this airplane that made you feel, well, I wouldn't mind fighting in this airplane and take on fighters at the same time and deal with them. I think this was a standard bearer, really, for long-haul aviation at that stage in the history of aviation. And it was simply beautiful airplane to fly, and could operate with one or two engines out quite safely. And altogether, built to me, was the acme of safe civil flying. Wonderful airplane because of this tremendous harmony of control. I would put it as one of the great airplanes of all time. Beautiful shape, flies every bit as good as it looks. Sidney Cam had the ability to draw beautiful aesthetic shapes, but that's one thing. If they flew just as beautifully as they looked, that's quite another, and the Hunter did just that. The Comet was ahead of its time and ran into disaster. A design fault halted in its tracks what might have been one of the great civil airliners of all time. But that's fate. VC-10 was, I liked it because I thought the engine layout was unusual, and it was, I thought, very satisfactory. Passengers seemed to love the noise of the VC-10, or the lack of, I should say. People complained of VC-10 being noisy outside, but for passenger comfort, it took a lot of beating. And it was a pilot's airplane. Pilots loved it. The finest aircraft ever built, in my opinion. Certainly the finest I ever flew. It was, if I had to describe it, I'd call it overpowered perfection. It had huge engines, flew beautifully. You could do as much with it on one engine almost as you could do on two. I used to give an air display where I did a loop on two engines, feathered one, did a loop on one, then feathered them both and did a loop on no engines, just for the momentum of coming from the previous loop. It was, wonderful airplane. A virtuoso, I would say, of slow flying. It was unbelievable what it could do at low speed. And a perfect aeroplane to be with the army in the field, for spotting for them, taking messages from one unit to another, all that sort of thing. Army cooperation, a perfect aeroplane in that sense. Well, this was Germany's great fighter. It frightened the life out of the RAF when it first appeared, because it appeared about a good year before the Spitfire 9. And we lost a lot of Spitfires in that year. They just could not cope with this aeroplane, which was a huge jump forward from the Spitfire 5. But once the 9 appeared, the Spitfire 9, things levelled out. And I would say the two of them were pretty evenly matched. And combat, frankly, would, I think, depend on the outcome would depend on the skill of the pilot. But they were pretty near. It was Germany's greatest fighter, just as the Spitfire was ours. Now, this is a strange aeroplane. When you fly it, you suddenly realize you've got to understand the Japanese philosophy of combat. They send their pilots out to kill, and they're there for no other purpose. They are not to defend themselves. They are meant to fight to the death. When you get in this airplane, the thing that strikes you is there's no bulletproof windscreen. There's no armour plating around you. There are no self-sealing fuel tanks. And you cannot jettison the hood. You're in a tin coffin, and that's where you're meant to be, as far as the Japs are concerned. That's their philosophy. And one must remember that to them, to be taken prisoner of war is the ultimate disgrace. Maybe that goes some way to explain their behaviour with our prisoners of war, but it's like that. But leaving these things aside, as a pure airplane, it was a phenomenally manoeuvrable airplane, very tight turning circle. And remember this, from the outset of the war till mid-1943, this was the finest fighter in the world on its record. And it was only when the Hellcat, Grumman Hellcat, arrived in the Far East that things changed. So this is really an outstanding low-level aeroplane, because the Far Eastern War was fought at low level, whereas the European eventually was fought at high level. Sea Fury, another beauty. It arrived after the war, but it had everything: power, maneuverability, and quite rugged in its own way, too, to withstand combat damage. Of course, post-war, it has had a wonderful record in the field of aviation racing. In America, it's used in the Reno air races and has had great success, although one must say, not always with the Centaurus engine. They have powered it with some of the bigger engines than that, but every American who's flown it has the highest praise for it. I mean, for its handling. It is a delightful airplane. The Americans brought out at the same time the Grumman Bearcat, and the two, if you had a combat with them, again, it'd be like the 190 and the Spitfire. It'd be the skill of the pilot that would tell. Phantom, one of the great fighters of all time. In its day, it was head and shoulders above anything that was around. And it's had a long life. It's a wonderful record, both of combat, efficiency, particularly in the Vietnamese War. And it's an airplane that suited both the Air Force and the Navy. It's pretty near perfect. Strangely enough, the saying goes that if it looks good, it flies good. When you see the Phantom with everything down, ready to land, it certainly doesn't look good. But by God, it flies well. Fast, of course, but very easy to control. Very easy. I found it I put it as I would say, apart from the high landing speed, which means you have to think a little bit faster, it had all the other assets you wanted from a naval airplane. Yes, I went on a posting which was really to build up the German naval air arm, because during World War II, Goering had insisted that everything that flies comes under his control. So the German naval air arm was really had denuded of its own power. And at the end of the war, they were left high and dry, of course, and as an effort to get them back into business, they appealed to NATO that if they could reform a German naval air arm, that they would be happy to assign it to NATO. So my job was to take quite a smattering, or even more than a smattering, a leavening of World War II pilots, together with an intake of the new generation of post-war pilots, and meld them all together into a force that we could assign to NATO. They had British aircraft, Seahawk, Gannet, as their main aircraft, and they were very adaptable, particularly the young ones. The older ones who had been in the previous Luftwaffe were a bit set in their ways, frankly. I found them a little more difficult to weld into a force than the young ones. The young ones were really up for the hunt. So that was the only difficult aspect of it, I would say. It was trying to get two generations together. Once at the end of the day, they were a very good fighting force, and I was very proud to hand them over to NATO. They unfortunately, when we finished, I had recommended to them that they continue thereafter with Buccaneers, which would have been ideal, I think. But the German manufacturers ganged up on the German services and insisted on having the F-104 Starfighter. The reason for this was that German industry realized they had been out of the game. They weren't allowed to manufacture until quite a while after the war was over. And they wanted to get back into the Mach 1, the supersonic league, in one jump. And they risked all and said, we'll have the F-104. Now, the services weren't happy with this. And, of course, there were a couple of things against them. To begin with, the version of the F-104 was called an all-purpose version, and it was 1,000 kilograms, that's 2,000 pounds, heavier than the American 104. Also, the Americans realized this was a tricky ship to fly, and they wouldn't let anybody touch it with less than 1,500 hours. The Germans were sending pilots in with 400 hours. They didn't have anybody with the modern aviation with 1,500 hours. And furthermore, these guys had only flown in the blue skies of Texas in their training, and when it came to Europe and the European weather and a difficult aeroplane and a heavier aeroplane, recipe for disaster. And what happened? They had almost 150 crashed, of which 50% of the crashes were fatal. Disaster in every sense of the word. Oh, it was very tricky. You had to have your wits about you. It was tricky in bad weather. It was a sensitive, very sensitive aircraft, and of course very high wing loading. But if you had an emergency and bad weather on your hands, you really needed a crackerjack pilot there to deal with it. There were denazification courts set up to look at these people before they were chosen to assume NATO posts. But I am not totally convinced that this was effective. There were some people, I certainly met some, that I would not have recommended that they be given the jobs they were given, because they were difficult to handle and often showed sparks of resentment about what had happened in the past. By that I mean about what Britain had done to Germany in the past. And they were still, I would have said they were still, in their off moments, Nazi sympathizers. And this was not good for morale. But we only had to wait about 5 years or 10 years, and they disappeared, and the young generation moved into place. But to give you an example of some of the things that happened, Bobby Hartmann, who was the top scorer in the whole Luftwaffe with 352 kills, was a prisoner of the Russians at the end of the war. So he had 10 years in Russia. When he came out, I had a chat with him, and I asked him, he's very interesting, I asked him, how did he ever get scores like that? And he said, well, you have to realize that all my flying, and it literally was all, was on the Eastern Front. And in one airplane, the Me-109. Different marks of the 109, but only in the 109. And he said the naivety, tactical naivety of the Russians was unbelievable. He said they would come out with huge formations of Aviation 2 aircraft, the Stormovik, and they would fly just straight and level in large gaggles, and think that the one pea shooter they had at the back, which was a 1.3 gun, would save them, because they had a lot of them. He said, they barely bothered us at all in the 109. He said, I wouldn't fire until their aircraft totally filled my windscreen. And then I'd only need a few bullets to shoot one down. And he said, in one sortie, he said, I've got as many as 6 aircraft in one sortie, because I used so little ammunition by getting right virtually up their tails. And he said, they never budged, they just sat there, with firing with this silly little gun at the back, if the guy hadn't already been killed. And he said there were a lot of women pilots amongst these. Not that he was denigrating what the women did, but he said it goes to show that they were getting down to using women for this type of work. So they must have been short of pilots anyway. And anyway, when he came out, he went into the Luftwaffe. But before I did that, I should tell you, I said to him, were you on the Eastern Front the entire time? He said, no, I had 1 month on the Western Front. And he said, I realize I am incredibly lucky to have survived it. He said it was a different ball game altogether. He said I didn't shoot down one aircraft on the Western Front, and he said I was lucky I wasn't shot down at least a couple of times. So he said that the two theatres were as different as chalk from cheese. And then he went into Luftwaffe, but having passed the denazification, and I think I would have agreed with that, and made a lieutenant colonel, but he was driven out of it by professional jealousy of his comrades, so-called, in the Luftwaffe. Yes, now this was interesting. It was quite a while after Dönitz had come out of his 10 years in prison, after the Nuremberg trials. And I was in the Naval Air Arm at this time, and a submarine ace up at Kiel, where we were based, had died, so there was to be a big funeral for him. And the Naval Air Arm were going to turn out, and I asked our Consul General what I should do, since I was part of the fleet of the Naval Air Arm, so to speak. And he asked back in England, and they said, go. So I lined up with all the other guys, and Dönitz went to the funeral. And afterwards, he came along and shook hands with every chap who had been there who was in uniform. And he just went along shaking hands, saying, nice to see you, or something similar. And he came to me and shook hands, nice to see you, and went on. And he'd gone 3 past me when he suddenly, something clicked, and he realized I wasn't in German uniform. So he came back, and he said, you're British, aren't you? And I said, yes, all this in German. And he said, what are you doing here? And I said, well, I'm training in the Naval Air Arm, and we've all come to pay our respects to a war hero. And he said, oh, that's very kind, thank you very much. And just went on. But when he got to the end of the line, and before stepping into his car, they all broke ranks and rushed over to surround him, his car. And in those days, you weren't allowed to cheer any ex-Nazi leader. So they didn't say a word, but they all took their hats off, as they do for the normal 3 cheers, hip, hip, hooray, and did this 3 times, but in complete silence. It's quite eerie. It was a time of the state visit of the Queen, her first to Germany, post-war Germany, and the enthusiasm for her was incredible. Right along the Rhine, they had painted on the banks of the Rhine, "Welcome to our Queen." because, of course, as you know, the family, a Battenberg family, are of German origin. But that does not involve our present Queen of etc. They're of the Windsors. And there were tremendous enthusiasm shown for her. But again, it gave me a chance to meet some of the new heads of state. For example, the new president of Germany, and Adenauer, who was the chancellor, Erhard, who was the chancellor. Oh, and one really got into the inner circle there. And I think they were genuinely working for a new Germany, of which they would be proud of, which would be of the kind that Britain wanted. They were not going to go the same route again. I'm quite convinced of that. Not many of them knew my background. But one remark that said, if we had known then what we know now, we would certainly have not allowed you and your car out of Germany. But apart from joking about it like that, they really didn't connect. I didn't talk about it much, and I didn't think it was the right thing to do in diplomatic circles, because inevitably they do not like to hear talk about the SS. This is interesting because I lecture in Germany today. I've been there fairly recently. And when I lectured 25 or 30 years ago, to a different generation, really, they didn't want to hear about any of the nasty things that went on. I was told never to mention any of the concentration camps, never to mention Hitler or Goering or Himmler or any of these people. And this time when I went, I took the same stance. I wasn't mentioning it, but they were a young generation, and they asked me to talk about Goering and Himmler, whom I interrogated, and it was quite different scene. And some of the people, some of the scientists I interrogated were remarkable people. We brought 26 back to Britain, of which we had to let them go. They were all prisoners of war, but you could only keep them for 2 years. That was the rule. So in mid-1947, they were to be released. But we offered them places at Farnborough as high-ranking civil servants if they would stay. And only 2 of them took it up. And they were the best 2. And one, of course, was the remarkable Dr. Kucherman, who really was the catalyst for Concord. So we really scored very well out of that. But they were very high-grade scientists. With the wind tunnel backgrounds they had, of course, they were unbeatable in their own field. To begin with, motivation, obviously, is the first. If you're not motivated, you're never going to want to fly. Secondly, once if that gets you there, I think you have got to believe that you're doing something that is going to take your full interest. You're not doing it because it's fashionable or because you think, this is a good sideline to have with the girls or anything like that. You have got to believe that you're hoping to take it even further than just ordinary flying. That, of course, the only way you take it further is either you go into civil aviation as an airline pilot or you go into the services. So I think if you get to the stage where you're thinking about either going civil or service, you have reached the motivation has been there, and then you're going to have to step up another gear. And that means you've got to improve your skills, particularly in blind flying. And that is usually a hurdle that brings a lot down, because it's not everybody takes kindly to that. But without it, you can neither operate in the two fields we just talked about. You'll only be a fun private pilot. So, as I say, motivation, good reactions, which you'll be tested for anyway. And if you want to go into something like test flying, I think a realization of what you're taking on, that you're not going into something just to fly different interesting aeroplanes. You're moving into a profession that has an element of risk in it that you've got to be prepared to face up to. Most of the really brilliant combat pilots were good shots. It was a hobby of theirs. For example, Johnny Johnson on our side was a very good shot. Galland was, and Bobby Hartman were both great shots with rifles, hunting people, really. So that is a great asset, because every fighter pilot goes through this unless he's been a good shot. There comes a period just after you've qualified where you don't think your camera gun shots show that you're not going to hit anything.
Aviation, the art of aeronautics, began with the dreamers, inventors and daredevils who dared to defy gravity. The journey of aviation was nurtured by pioneers like the Wright brothers, whose first flight marked a historic milestone. The role of aircrafts in world wars was groundbreaking, dramatically changing warfare strategies. This initiated a technological evolution in aviation, transforming the simplistic wings of a biplane into the thunderous roar of jet engines. Let's journey through the ages of aviation. Behind every great aircraft, there were great minds. These visionaries, like Sir Frank Whittle, the innovator of the turbojet engine, redefined air travel. Then there's Skunkworks Kelly Johnson, the genius behind the SR-71 Blackbird. His designs combined speed, stealth and power, crafting machines that dominated the heavens. The contributions of these pioneers have left an indelible mark on the canvas of aviation, shaping the course of history and inspiring generations of engineers and aviators. Each epoch in aviation history gave birth to extraordinary aircrafts, each with their own unique features and roles. The Lockheed SR-71 Blackbird was a marvel of speed and stealth. The F-105 Thunderchief, a supersonic fighter bomber, was vital in the Vietnam War. The P-51 Mustang, a long-range fighter, was critical in World War II. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a heavyweight fighter, was used extensively in the same war. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, the Warthog, is a close air support icon. The Messerschmitt Me-262 marked a leap forward in aviation technology. Each of these game changers were instrumental in their eras, and their legacies still resonate today. Beyond the game changers, there are those that have transcended their practical roles to become icons. The Concorde was not just an aircraft, it was a supersonic symbol of luxury and speed. The B-52 Stratofortress, a strategic bomber, is an icon of power and resilience. These magnificent machines and others like them have become much more than just aircrafts. They are enduring icons that encapsulate the audacious spirit, the relentless innovation, and the boundless ambition that define the world of aviation. for more amazing aerial footage. And to join us in this incredible journey, check out the DroneScapes YouTube channel.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.